This is part 3 of a video series I'm making on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. In part 1, I went over historical methodology. If you haven't seen this video yet, I recommend that you watch it first so that you understand what I'm doing and don't attack a straw man because I cite a passage from the New Testament. I'm not doing anything different than what any non-Christian historian would do when I approach the New Testament. I'm applying the criteria of authenticity to them to see what we can affirm as historical, wholly apart from presupposing the inspiration or inerrancy of the New Testament. This is how historians would approach any ancient document. I also explained that I'll be using a minimal facts approach. In part 2, I went over the evidence for that first minimal fact, that Jesus died by crucifixion. In this video, I'll be going over the second minimal fact, the empty tomb. There are several reasons to believe that Jesus' tomb was empty on that first Easter morning. First is the Jerusalem factor. Jesus' resurrection was first publicly proclaimed in Jerusalem. That the resurrection was first preached in Jerusalem is independently attested by the Roman historian Tacitus and also by the Book of Acts. The Roman historian Tacitus writes, quote, "Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular." Here Tacitus says that the movement of Christianity, named after Christus, who suffered the extreme penalty under Pontius Pilate, it broke out in Judea, which he says was, quote-unquote, the first source of the evil. So Christianity started in Judea. And in Acts chapter 2, we read the events of Pentecost, and Peter preaches his first sermon to the Jews. You know, after everybody started speaking in tongues, and some heckler said that they were drinking, and Peter says, no, we're not drinking, it's only 9 in the morning. So both Acts chapter 2 and Tacitus independently attest that Christianity, the preaching of the resurrection, started in Judea. Jerusalem is in Judea. So we have two independent sources that the resurrection preaching started in Judea, and therefore we have multiple attestation that it is a fact. Now, given that both the Book of Acts and Tacitus independently report that Christianity got its start in the world, and therefore it's multiply attested, and ergo a historical fact, we have to wonder, since Jesus was crucified in that very same city, if Jesus' body were still in the tomb, preaching on the resurrection could never have gotten off the ground. Christianity had a lot of enemies. If anyone wanted to disprove the resurrection, all they would have had to do would be to go down to the tomb, pluck the body out of the tomb, and parade it down the streets for all to see. They could even go so far as to string Jesus' corpse up in a high place so that even more people could get a glimpse at it. Everyone who got a look at Jesus' body would have known that the disciples' message was false. If the enemies of Christianity had done this, Christianity would have died before it even got off the ground. However, Christianity didn't die. It's still one of the most prominent religions today. How is this to be explained? Why didn't the enemies of Christianity go down to Jesus' tomb and exhume his corpse for all to see, dismantling Christianity from the get-go? I think the reason they didn't take Jesus' body out of the tomb is because there was no body to be taken out. They would have plucked his body out of the tomb and paraded it down the street for all to see if they could have, but they were unable to. Why? Because the tomb was empty. The body was gone. There was no body to be exhumed. That is the only reasonable explanation I can come up with for why the enemies of Christianity didn't just show everyone the corpse and prove that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Now, some object that Jesus' body was unrecognizable by the time the disciples started proclaiming the resurrection, so producing the corpse would have done no good. After all, the book of Acts says that the preaching on the resurrection didn't occur until 50 days after the crucifixion. This is more than enough time for decomposition to take place and for a corpse to become unrecognizable. So if the disciples had started running around telling folks that he had risen from the dead and the enemies had produced the corpse, all the disciples would have had to say was, that's not Jesus. There are some problems with this objection. First of all, in the arid climate of Jerusalem, a corpse's distinctive wounds, stature, hair color, and hairstyle would have been identifiable even after 50 days. Therefore, it would have been no trouble to figure out whether or not the corpse in question belonged to Jesus. A person could examine the corpse's physical stature, weight, distinctive wounds. Hey, does this corpse bear the wounds consistent with a crucified victim? Hair color, style, to see if it was consistent with what one would expect Jesus' corpse to look like. Just look, are there crucifixion wounds in the hands, in the feet, in the side? You don't even need to be a trained forensic pathologist to do that. Anyone of any education level could check these things out. Secondly, even if Jesus' body truly was unrecognizable, we still would have expected any body at all to have created a mass exodus from the Christian church, even if a small number of adherents remained. Such an exodus would surely have been picked up by Lucian of Samosata, who was ridiculing Christianity in his work and would surely have loved to use such an incident as evidence against the Christians' claims. Moreover, we would expect the early church apologists, like Justin Martyr, to try to respond and explain this mass exodus and why there was a body in Jesus' tomb if Jesus had really risen. We would especially expect the Apostle Paul to address such an incident in his epistles. Yet history is silent on such an exodus. None of the non-Christian historians say anything about it, Paul says nothing about it, and none of the early church fathers feel compelled to address it. Reason 2. All 4 Gospels feature women as witnesses to the empty tomb. All 4 Gospels feature women as witnesses, the first witnesses to Jesus' empty tomb. Now, why is this significant? As I briefly mentioned in the previous video, women were considered second-class citizens in the first century. Talmud Sota 19a says, quote, "Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women," end quote. The Talmud even contains a rabbinic saying that goes like this: "Blessed is he whose children are male, but woe to him whose children are female." And according to the Jewish historian Josephus, their testimony was considered so untrustworthy that they weren't even permitted to serve as a witness in a Jewish court of law. Josephus wrote, quote, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex, nor let servants be admitted to give testimony on account of the ignobility of their soul, since it is probable that they may not speak truth, either out of hope of gain or fear of punishment," end quote. Women were, A, second-class citizens, and B, considered to be so untrustworthy that no one wanted them to even stand as witnesses in a court of law. In light of this fact, how remarkable it is that it is women who are said to be the chief witnesses to the empty tomb. If the gospel authors were playing fast and loose with the facts, they surely would have made male disciples, such as Peter or John, the chief witnesses to the empty tomb. The fact that it is women, instead of men, who are said to be the first witnesses to the empty tomb is best explained by the fact that the gospel narratives were just telling it like it happened. The empty tomb narratives in the gospels were true. They weren't making it up. To make women your first witnesses to the empty tomb would be to insert words into the mouths of witnesses who would likely not be believed. Therefore, by the criterion of embarrassment, we have good reason to believe that the tomb was empty. Now, if you need more evidence that the making women to the first witnesses to the tomb would have been embarrassing, consider the fact that Celsus The 2nd century critic of Christianity mocked the idea of Mary Magdalene as an alleged resurrection witness. This is what Celsus said. This was actually an objection to the reliability of the resurrection accounts that Christian apologists in the 1st and 2nd centuries had to deal with. It works in our favor today, but back then it worked against them. And it was a point that Celsus used to mock the resurrection. This is why critics who try to respond to the embarrassment argument by saying, oh, well, women had a very high status in the early church and they were respected, and look at it how even Jesus treated women, and so, it wouldn't have been such a big deal for them to include women as witnesses to the empty tomb because the early church didn't consider them to be second-class citizens and unreliable witnesses. Well, that's true, but you have to remember that they were preaching the gospel message to people who didn't believe them. They were spreading out across the Roman world. And even though they had a higher view of women than the rest of the world, that's just, you don't make women your first witnesses. If you're trying to convince somebody, you put your best foot forward. And this is probably why in the early 1 Corinthians 15 creed that we'll talk about in the next video, the appearance to the women is absent. They're not in there. Now, let's go on to the next argument. Reason 3. The enemies of Christianity presupposed the vacancy of the tomb when they said that the disciples stole the body. When a child tells his teacher that the dog ate his homework, that presupposes that the homework is not in the child's possession. When the enemies of Christianity had to resort to accusing the disciples of stealing the body, that presupposes that there was no body in the tomb. Matthew chapter 28 verses 11 to 15 says, quote, "While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, 'You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day." End quote. This is powerful evidence due to the criterion of enemy attestation. Now, you might be wondering why we should view this as good evidence for the empty tomb, since it comes from Matthew's gospel and not directly from the Jewish leadership themselves. It's not like it's coming out of a book written by Caiaphas, where Caiaphas writes, "The tomb was empty because the disciples took his body," or anything like that. Couldn't Matthew have made this up simply to make the empty tomb story seem more credible? Well, no, I don't think so. I say that for 3 reasons. First, consider the fact that Matthew says, "This story has been widely circulated to this very day." Now, what does "to this very day" mean? Clearly, Matthew is saying that the opponents of Christianity were running around spreading this story even at the very time period that he was penning these words. They were making this claim to potential converts even during the very time period that Matthew was writing his gospel. If the anti-Christian Jews were not making that accusation, then Matthew could have easily been falsified. People could have gone to the Jewish leadership and asked them, "We read in the Gospel of Matthew that you deny Jesus rose from the dead. You explained his empty tomb away by saying that they stole the body. Is this true?" If it wasn't true, the Jewish leadership could have said, "What? We said no such thing. What are you talking about?" Would Matthew really open himself up to such easy falsification? Secondly, people don't usually respond to accusations unless there's an accusation made of them to respond to. Imagine you walk into your front yard and discover that your car is missing. In a panic, you cry out, "My car is gone! My car is gone! What happened to it? Dude, where's my car?" And then your friend shows up and says, "Gee, that's a shame. I don't know what happened to your car, but it's not like I stole it or anything." You would look at your friend funny and say, "I never said that you stole my car. Wait a minute, is there something you're not telling me?" People simply don't respond to accusations unless there is truly an accuser. In those rare moments that they do respond to non-existent accusations, they cause themselves to look guilty of the very thing they're denying. Thirdly, the claims of the opponents of Christianity is multiply attested. In Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, he responds to this accusation from the Jews, and Tertullian rebuts it as well in his work De Spectaculis. This implies that the enemies of Christianity really were making this claim. It originated in the 1st century and persisted throughout the 2nd and 3rd. Reason 4. The empty tomb is multiply attested. Earlier in this series, I said that most scholars believe that Matthew and Luke used a lot of material from Mark, and in those particular circumstances, we don't have independent attestation among the synoptics. That said, I also said that this wasn't always the case. With regards to certain incidents, the synoptics aren't borrowing from one another at all. The empty tomb is one such case. Matthew is clearly working with an independent source, for he includes the story of the guard at the tomb, which is unique to his gospel. Neither Mark nor Luke mention a guard at the tomb, so one would be hard-pressed to make a case that Luke and Matthew are copying off of Mark here. It's not in Mark. Luke also has an independent source because he tells the story of 2 disciples visiting the tomb to check out Mary Magdalene's report. This is not found in Mark or Matthew. And again, like I said before, everyone agrees that the Gospel of John is independent from all of the synoptics, given how different John is from the other 3. So in this case, the empty tomb is reported in 4 independent sources. Remember from the last video that I quoted Paul Meyer as saying that most historical incidents are confirmed on the basis of only one source, and if you can find 2 independent sources, that makes an event impregnable. Regarding the discovery of the empty tomb, we have not just 2 independent sources, but 4. 4 independent sources attest to the fact that Jesus' tomb was empty the Sunday following his execution. You have another source when you consider the early Pauline creed cited in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute. Paul never mentions the empty tomb in 1 Corinthians 15. This is a half-truth. While the empty tomb is not explicitly mentioned in the creed, it is implicitly mentioned. Dr. William Lane Craig explains that the old tradition cited in Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 3 to 5 implies the fact of the empty tomb. For any first-century Jew to say that of a dead man that he was buried and that he was raised is to imply that a vacant grave left behind. And as N.T. Wright put it, for a first-century Jew, they would not have to say Jesus died, was buried, his tomb was empty, and he rose from the dead, any more than you would have to qualify the sentence, I walked down the street, with the qualification, on my feet. The fact that you used your feet would have been presupposed. Likewise, for a first-century Jew, for a man to be raised from the dead, an empty tomb would have just been assumed. So if we add the Pauline Creed to the 4 Gospels, we have a total of 5 independent sources attesting that Jesus' tomb was found empty. What are the odds that 5 independent sources would all make up the same lie? 5 independent writers all making up the same lie. I cannot bring myself to believe that. Reason 5. The phrase, on the 3rd day, is best explained by the historicity of the empty tomb. The expression on the 3rd day implies the empty tomb. Now, I know what you might be thinking, how in the world does that work? Here's how it works. Since no one was actually sitting in the tomb, saw Jesus' body begin to glow and radiate, they saw him sit up, fold his garments, and walk out of the tomb, then why did the early disciples date the resurrection on the 3rd day? Why not the 4th day? Why not the 5th day? Why not the 117th day? I think the most reasonable inference is that this was the amount of time after Jesus' execution that his women followers found the sepulchre vacant, so the resurrection naturally came to be dated itself to that point in time. Reason 5. Mark's account is simple and lacks signs of embellishment. Dr. William Lane Craig explains that
Thirdly, Mark's story of the empty tomb is simple and lacks signs of legendary embellishment. All one has to do to appreciate this point is to compare Mark's account to the accounts which are found in the later apocryphal Gospels. These are forgeries that arose during the centuries following the appearance of the New Testament. These do contain all sorts of wild, legendary accounts about the resurrection. For example, in the so-called Gospel of Peter, which is a forgery from the second half of the 2nd century after Christ, the tomb is surrounded not only by a Roman guard, but also by all of the chief priests and the Pharisees, as well as a huge crowd of people from the surrounding countryside who have come to watch the tomb. Suddenly, during the night, a voice rings out from heaven, and the stone over the door of the tomb rolls back by itself. Then 2 men are seen descending out of heaven and entering into the tomb. Then 3 men, gigantic figures, come out of the tomb. The heads of 2 of the men reach to the clouds. The head of the 3rd man overpasses the clouds. And then a cross comes out of the tomb, and a voice from heaven asks, "Hast thou preached to them that sleep?" And the cross answers, "Yea." Now, these are how real legends look. They are colored with all sorts of theological and apologetical motifs, motifs which are conspicuously lacking from the Markan account, which by comparison is stark in its simplicity.
Reason 7. The criterion of multiple literary forms. The empty tomb is repeated as miracle in John chapter 20, as creed, 1 Corinthians 15:4, and didactic, see Acts chapter 2, verses 24 to 32. Reason 8. The reason the women went to the tomb fit the criterion of historical fit. The reason the Gospels say that the women even went down to the tomb to begin with lends credence to the accounts. It was a standard practice of Jews to anoint the bodies of dead friends and family members. Why the women didn't go on Saturday is very likely due to the fact that it was the Sabbath, the shops were closed, and they couldn't buy perfumes and ointments with which to anoint the body. They would have to wait until Sunday when the shops were open before they could get the perfumes to anoint Jesus' body. See Mark chapter 16 verses 1 to 5 and Luke chapter 23 verses 56 and Luke chapter 24 verses 1 to 3. So the criterion of historical fit, which is also known as the criterion of coherence, is applicable here. Reason 9. The Nazareth Decree. Now, Dr. Norman Geisler writes that, quote, "A slab of stone was found in Nazareth in 1878, inscribed with a decree from Emperor Claudius, AD 41 to 51, that no graves should be disturbed or bodies extracted or moved. This type of decree is not uncommon, but the startling fact is that here the offender shall be sentenced to capital punishment on the charge of a violation of a sepulchre." Hemer, BASHH 155. Others notices warned of a fine, but death for disturbing graves? A very likely explanation is that Claudius, having heard of the Christian doctrine of resurrection and Jesus' empty tomb while investigating the riots of AD 49, decided not to let any such report surface again. This would make sense in light of the Jewish argument that the body had been stolen, Matthew chapter 28 verses 11 to 15. This is early testimony to the strong and persistent belief that Jesus rose from the dead, end quote. Why would Claudius issue the death penalty for disturbing graves? That seems like an extreme overreaction. However, as Geisler said in the citation, it makes sense if Claudius knew of the Jewish polemic against Jesus' empty tomb and was trying to prevent any alleged resurrections from occurring again. Again, like I said, this is not conclusive proof of the empty tomb. Claudius may have had some other reason for making such a harsh penalty for disturbing graves. It's possible, but it is indicative. I really can't think of any other plausible reason why Emperor Claudius would treat so mild a crime as grave robbing so seriously. Finally, reason 10. Jesus' tomb was never venerated as a shrine. The philosopher and apologist J.P. Moreland explains that, quote, in Palestine, during the days of Jesus, at least 50 tombs of prophets or other holy persons served as sites of religious worship and veneration. However, there is no good evidence that such a practice was ever associated with Jesus' tomb. Since this was customary, and since Jesus was a fitting object of veneration, why were such religious activities not conducted at his tomb? The most reasonable answer must be that Jesus' body was not in his tomb, and thus the tomb was not regarded as an appropriate site for such veneration. It seems, then, that the lack of veneration at the tomb of Jesus is powerful evidence that the tomb was empty, end quote. And by the way, the non-Christian historian Dale Allison agrees. Summary and conclusion. We have seen 10 good reasons to believe that Jesus' tomb was empty the Sunday morning following his execution. Now, an empty tomb by itself does not prove anything. An empty tomb can be explained in a number of different ways. In order to have enough evidence to infer the resurrection of Jesus, we need more. And this will be unpacked in the next couple of videos.